afternoon. Welcome everyone to a new employment law series from Haynesworth Sinclair Boyd. It's good to be back with everybody after a little while off, and we're going to be talking today about something other than COVID. Fortunately, although COVID is certainly back in everybody's minds as far as what to do with their workplaces. We thought we were over it. Unfortunately, we're not, and we may be doing some more future webinars on that front. But we are going to be doing a series of webinars over the next few months on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And today's webinar is going to be the first in that series. And today we're going to be talking about pay equity. And I am joined with me on today's webinar by Brandi Parrish Ellison, who is the Senior Director of Policy and Programs at the South Carolina Women's Rights and Empowerment Network. And in a couple of minutes, I'll let Brandi introduce herself, and I'll tell you a little bit more about WREN and the good work that they do over there. A couple of reminders. I know many of you joining us today have attended these in the past, but for those of you that are new, a quick word about Haynesworth Sinclair Boyd, full service law firm throughout South Carolina, with offices in Charleston, Columbia, Florence, and Greenville. We do pretty much any type of business work. Chris Gant Sorensen and I and a few others practice in the area of employment law. We've got a pretty large team across the state doing that type of work. If you're not already on our blog to receive updates on employment law news and alerts, as well as information about upcoming webinars and events, please sign up for that. We have a Q&A in this Zoom platform that you are free to use. What we will do is set aside a little bit of time at the end for questions, but feel free to sort of type those into the Q&A or the chat box, and we can monitor those as we go along. And if it's pertinent, we could look at it and maybe address it while we're going through, but we will have a little bit of time at the end to run through some of those. We will send these presentations out to everyone following the event. So no need to sort of frantically copy down what's on the slides. The course has been submitted for all the continuing education credits, and a legal disclaimer that the things that we're going to be talking about today are not targeted, not legal advice. These are just, general thoughts and recommendations on the topic of pay equity. So before we get started into the details here, I'll let Brandi, our valued guest, introduce herself and tell you a little bit about WREN.
Great. Thank you, Perry. Again, my name is Brandi Parrish Ellison, and I am the Senior Director of Policy and Programs for the Women's Rights and Empowerment Network, also known as WREN. Hopefully you've heard about us. We're a state-based organization whose mission is to build a movement to advance the health, economic well-being, and rights of South Carolina's women, girls, and their families. We do this through a number of avenues, including advocating the General Assembly and other state agencies for policies and laws that improve the health and well-being of women and girls. We also do a lot of public education around issues, and really hoping to inspire action. And that could be community-based education or working with businesses to educate them on some of the policies and procedures that would ensure gender equity in the workplace. We also work with decision makers on all levels. We engage the community and really work to build the capacity of organizations to advocate for the people that they represent. So we do a lot of coalition building, and engagement of individuals across the state to work together to make a better South Carolina for women and girls. In my role, I get to lead a group of a team that works out in the community, working on policy and advocacy issues. We're an 8-person staff, an 8-person mighty staff. I am located in Columbia, South Carolina, but we do have people on the ground in Charleston, and we did in the upstate for a little while, but I'm hoping to replace that position soon. So yeah, we do a lot of really great work around the state. We have about 40,000 members of our network who we engage in policy and advocacy issues. We are currently, to give you kind of a feel for what we're working on right now, we're working on a policy to improve access or to ensure access to paid parental leave for state employees, among many other bills that address, economic recovery for women. We have led the passage of the Accommodations Act. I'm sure you've all heard about it. That was about 3 years ago now, and that bill ensures that employers provide reasonable accommodations for their pregnant employees, so a stool, a water bottle, or a break. We really value and see the importance of women's role in the workforce, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So we really work on policies and educate around that, among many other things that affect women and girls. So yeah, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Brandi. That's very helpful. Some of you, we've talked about the Pregnancy Accommodations Act on these webinars before. I think many of you are familiar with that. So you probably heard me reference South Carolina WREN before with respect to that law that was passed several years ago. Paid parental leave is obviously a big issue at the state and federal level also. So that's one to keep an eye on. And their SCRN's website is really good. They've got their website broken down into specific issues like pay equity that we'll talk about today. And, they link to what the current legislation before the South Carolina General Assembly is, and tell you sort of what the research behind that is, all that kind of stuff. So it's a good resource for all of you to sort of take a look at and monitor what the issues are before the General Assembly that could affect employers with respect to some of those issues. So, all right. Well, based on that, you can probably see why we've invited Brandi to talk with us today also about pay equity. And this is just an overview of sort of what we're going to talk about today. I think it's important to start out sort of talking about what pay equity is and why it's important. I think pay equity is sort of one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot without a lot of understanding of what it really means and what the law is and what the goals are. So we'll talk about the current state of the law, what legislatures and advocates are trying to do with respect to the law, and talk about a couple of ancillary legal issues around that. And then sort of at the end, we'll talk about, practically speaking, what you as employers should be thinking about. What can you do about the issue? Pay transparency is sort of a broader movement that includes pay equity, but also includes being more transparent with your workforce about how you set compensation, both to your current workforce as well as to those that you're recruiting. So we'll touch on that as well as we go through. So I want to start, I think, by just having a little bit of a conversation around what pay equity is. I think that a lot of times when I have conversations with clients or others about pay equity, one of the, some of the pushback I get often is, a comment along the lines of, well, I don't think everybody should be paid the same in my workforce. And so I think it's important to sort of highlight at the outset that pay equity really is more about fair compensation, as opposed to just paying everybody that works for you the exact same, sort of regardless of anything else. I think that's a little bit of a misconception. And so when we talk about fair compensation, what we're really talking about is making sure that you've got a compensation scheme in place that pays people according to their worth, without regard to the person's color, the person's sex, or anything else, without regard to anything that doesn't have to do with the business or the person's value to the business. And traditionally, this has often been addressed in the context of men versus women. We'll talk about the Equal Pay Act and sort of how that came about. And we'll talk about some of the numbers with respect to the quote unquote wage gap that exists between men and women in the workforce. But really, when we're talking about pay equity, there's been increasing focus on the pay gap with minority groups of employees. And it really can be any group of employees, by age or, religious affiliation or anything like that. It's not just male, female, although we do know that there is a substantial gap there in what men and women are paid in the workforce, which we will talk about in a minute. So that's what pay equity is. And I'll let Brandi talk a little bit about what sort of some of the research is out there and why it's important.
Great. So WREN commissioned a study out of the Darla Moore School of Business at USC a couple of years ago to study the gender and racial wage gap in our state, to really examine what the cause and consequence of the gender and racial wage gap. And what we found is that women who are working full-time in South Carolina on average make 77 cents for every dollar that a man earns. And Black women actually make about 57 cents to every dollar that a man makes. And we actually have one of the widest wage gaps in the country. And this is even if you compare by industry to industry or job type to job type. So there is a pay difference that is very real and is crossing pretty much every industry, even those that are female dominated. So we really want to lift this up to ensure that being paid fairly and equitably is critical for families, but also for the recovery of COVID and the resilience of our workforce in South Carolina. So women make up over 2/3 of South Carolina's low-wage workforce, which is typically our hourly workforce. And one fact that is pretty incredible, I think, is that 2/3 of South Carolina families have a woman as a primary or co-breadwinner. So that means that South Carolina families really rely on the income that women bring home to help provide for the families. So and women tend to also be the ones who spend their income on family-related needs, whether it be school supplies or clothing for the kids or medical bills and things like that. So this is makes this factor of being paid fairly and equitably for comparable work so important. So part of the study that I mentioned earlier, we looked at if all working women in South Carolina were paid comparable, the same to men, then the average earnings that a woman would make would increase by a little over $6,000 a year. That's 0.7%. And if you combine all that for all working women, the state would add over $7 billion to its economy, which is an equivalent of 3% of the state's GDP. And that's based on 2019 numbers. We're running them again now, but I'll tell you, after COVID and the changes in the workforce that have drastically impacted women, we'll see that number shift. So closing the gender wage gap in South Carolina obviously would help build economic security for families, provide a boost in the economy, and most of all, ensure an equitable recovery from COVID. We are sitting in a moment where we have an amazing opportunity to build a more equitable economy, a more gender equitable economy, and there are different policies, both internal and legislative policies, and just ways of examining the way we work, the types of opportunities we provide, all of that. This is like the perfect moment, a perfect open window to examine that and ensure that our employees, all of our employees, are being paid fairly and equitably, really contributing to the recovery of the economy.
Thanks, Brandi. And I think, those general numbers as far as what the wage gap is are pretty consistent, I think, with other research and studies that have been done. And, I think there are, if you do some research into this, which I'm sure some of you have, that you will see that there are some attempted explanations that people try to make for why it exists, and how it exists, and what the best way to deal with it is. I don't think we're going to get into the nuances of those arguments for purposes of today's presentation. I think I would say that certainly not all of the pay gap is attributable to big bad employers out there that are trying to intentionally discriminate against women or minority groups or whomever is negatively impacted by this. But certainly there are things which we'll talk about in recruiting and things like that may be a little bit more, not intentional, but things that have past practices that have stuck around that may be perpetuating that. And so just want to make that point with respect to where the wage gap is.
I totally agree. Most employers that I talk to actually want to pay their employees equitably. They want to understand what are the practices that they're perpetuating that could lead to pay inequity. So I've just in my conversation, most employers want to do the right thing, but it's like, what's next? What are the first steps, and how do you kind of take those kind of practical steps forward to get the ball rolling? So I totally agree.
Yeah, and so we'll talk a little bit about those at the end. I do want to spend a little bit of time on the boring stuff, which is the law, because this is obviously this is a big public policy issue. This is an issue about our economy, about our state, all of those types of things. But for those of you that are in charge of managing risk for a business or concerned about risk for a business, run an HR department where you are expected to comply with the law. There are currently laws in place on this. And I think it's surprise many of you, what the law says and what the potential legislation is going to be. But there's a number of legal protections in place already, which seek to ensure that no one is discriminated against in the way that they're compensated based upon their sex or their protected class. So at the federal level, and we'll dive into these, but you have the Equal Pay Act. You've got Title VII, which most of you are familiar with, which is the general anti-discrimination federal law. And then at the state level, we also have a South Carolina Human Affairs law, which sort of mimics Title VII in some ways, but is a state law that the Human Affairs Commission can investigate as well. So we'll dive into each of those now. The one that some of you have maybe heard about and have maybe heard some of the criticism potentially of is the Equal Pay Act, which was a 1963 federal law, which was enacted as part of President Kennedy's New Frontier program. And this law, if you notice the year, this was actually passed before Title VII of the Civil Rights Act was passed. That was 1964 under President Johnson's program. And so this Equal Pay Act actually amends the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the federal wage and hour law that governs minimum wage and overtime and that type of thing. So it is separate from Title VII, but it's enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which most of you are familiar with, which regulates and investigates allegations of workplace discrimination. Claims are pretty rare. I think that Chris and the other employment lawyers at the firm would tell you that we handle a lot of EEOC investigations and lawsuits claiming discrimination, and the claims under the Equal Pay Act are pretty rare, and we'll sort of go into why that is. One important thing about the Equal Pay Act is it prohibits sex-based wage discrimination. So this law is focused on men and women. And so that's how, the issue was, there was a huge issue with it at that time. And it was only meant to address that. And we'll talk about Title VII. It protects the others as well. But essentially what the Equal Pay Act says is that men and women are to be compensated for substantially equal skill, effort, and responsibility under similar working conditions. So if you have person A and person B, and they are working in jobs with substantially equal skill, effort, and responsibility under similar working conditions, those two individuals, that there really should not be a pay discrepancy between those two individuals. And, really some of the criticism of that law has been, one of the criticisms has been this substantially equal skill, effort, and responsibility under similar working conditions. Some advocates have argued that that gives businesses a little bit too much leeway in this sort of responsibility under similar conditions. Although got to be at the same facility to sort of differentiate among employees when really there could be something else going on. And so that's essentially what the law says. It's pretty straightforward. There are exceptions that could be used by employers to justify a pay differential. So even if you have employee A, employee B, and they are working in substantially similar jobs, but they're paid differently, there's still exceptions in the law for a business to come in and say, yes, they're paid differently for essentially the same job, but this is why they're paid differently. And those are what you see on the screen. Person A has been in the job for 30 years. Person B has been in the jobs for 2 years. And we have a bona fide seniority system at our company, which rewards employees for years of service, something like that. A bona fide merit system, whereby we do an annual performance review, and depending on that performance review, your salary may be increased, proportionally depending on how good your review is. An incentive system for this person's compensation was higher last year because they hit their sales targets, and they were, given commissions for that, and that's part of an incentive system. So those three are pretty straightforward, and I think most of you would acknowledge that seems fair enough. there's a fourth one built into the law, which says, and I have written up here other business factors that are non-discriminatory. That's really, that's not very good wording on my part, because really what it is basically it says any factor other than sex. And so that basically means that if the business can point to anything in the world that would differentiate the two employees that's not their sex, then that can be legal under the Equal Pay Act. And it's really that kind of fourth factor there that advocacy groups and pending legislation have said we need to reform that. And the Paycheck Fairness Act is a law that's been kicked around at the federal level for years and years, which its primary purpose is to kind of address that fourth element, to say, instead of a factor other than sex, we're going to make the business show that that factor has to serve a legitimate business interest. That, okay, if you're going to differentiate between, if you say the difference between employee A, employee B was employee A drives a Lamborghini and employee B drives a Honda Civic, and we like the Lamborghini better. And so that was the differentiator. Technically speaking, that might be valid under the Equal Pay Act, but what the pending legislation seeks to address is to say, yeah, but it's got to be something that's a legitimate business interest. And, Lamborghini versus Honda Civic, the car they drive, doesn't serve any legitimate business interest. So advocacy groups have sort of claimed that fourth factor is a way for businesses to come up with anything under the sun that might justify the pay differential. Title VII, which was passed a year later, is much broader in its application. It applies to any protected category. So, not only can you not have a pay differential between men and women, but for religious affiliation or national origin, things like that, all the protected classes that you're familiar with under Title VII. And it seeks to really engage any type of discriminatory behavior, or, adverse action type that you're familiar with in the Title VII context, like pay decisions and limiting of opportunities and things like that. It sort of seeks to capture all those as well. Equal pay claims under Title VII are still pretty rare in my world for what we see. And we can talk about what some of the reasons or the stigma may be behind some of those claims. There was a federal law, Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which established that each paycheck is a continuing violation. So that basically that means like the statute of limitations for someone bringing a claim that they're not being paid as much as one of their counterparts, they can bring that at any time. Every time they receive a paycheck that they allege is different, that's a new violation, essentially. So that's sort of a little bit of an inside baseball thing there, but it is important. And then we've got the ADEA, and the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. All the alphabet soup here. Those laws basically take the same concept and apply them to age and disability. And these claims are even more rare, although the disability context, you do see some discussion around this, especially with respect to the minimum wage discussions around individuals with disabilities. This has come up in South Carolina recently. But the statistics I have seen have suggested that the older the employee group, the worse the pay gap is for sex and for minority groups. And that could be, surviving sort of old, traditional ways of viewing things. I just made a note here. This is, sort of off topic, but I mean, a more common issue I get is sort of clients coming to me and saying that let's say because of the seniority system, they've got an employee who has been there for 35 years who is paid way too much in comparison to younger people, and they're not pulling their weight, and are not justifying their compensation, but because they've been there for so long, this is what they're being paid. And so that's sort of a separate issue, but did want to point that out because I do have a lot of people asking about that. So that's kind of what the current state of the law is and where we stand right now. I think it's pretty straightforward as to what your compliance responsibilities are. I'm going to let Brandi talk a little bit about some of the pending legislation in South Carolina, the Act to Establish Pay Equity, and I'll try to pipe in as well. But I know they've done some work with these bills. There's one in the House and one in the Senate right now.
Thanks. Yeah, so we've been working for a few years on educating policymakers at the state level and people in the community about ways that we could improve pay equity through policy change. The Act to Establish Pay Equity, again, both we have similar bills in the House and Senate. They both would ensure that jobs that require the same skill, effort, and responsibility be paid the same. And if there's a difference in pay, it has to be based on an actual business factor. And we went through some of those. So it would prevent employers from seeking previous salary or wage history, because we know if someone has been discriminated against in their, based on pay in their past job, that can continue to carry forward with them as they advance or move into just different jobs in their careers. It does not prevent a potential employee from sharing that with an employer, but it does remove that ability for an employer to ask for that information. And that way, no matter who's applying for the job, you're looking at the person's experience, their education, and all of the factors that they bring to the table when establishing that. It also increases transparency in compensation discussions. This is something that I see more and more businesses doing, and I think it's really, really great. Employers would have to give the wage ranges to job applicants. And we'll talk about pay audits and things like that later, but just establishing a pay or a compensation philosophy, establishing pay ranges for similar positions like managers and associates. I don't know, I'm just picking two things, or even let's say on a more, let's say within the hotel industry, if there are people who do housekeeping and sanitation work, those two jobs require the same skill, effort, and responsibility. They're very different titles, and one tends to be more male than the other, and one tends to be more female heavy, if you will. And so really looking at pay based on those two, positions that are similar, and making sure that there's pay ranges that are established and that people work within. And that way you can go back to those business factors and say, well, for this position, this is the, it could be a range of however big, this is the range. And based on your seniority, your education, and, your annual review, you make a certain amount within that range, right? So it still gives that flexibility, but it just establishes kind of some boundaries there. And then giving the position ranges to current employees on a regular basis, so that people know this is your pay range for your position, and that also helps them as an employee be able to know what that is, the transparency, be able to negotiate. And be very clear about, what is possible within their position and pay range. So yeah, these are a few things that the primary things that Bill will cover.
And I think, I'd be interested to hear from everybody on the call as to what you're doing currently with respect to recruiting, whether you're asking people what they made at their prior job. Are you posting ranges, for the job? Are you posting a non-negotiable starting salary for the job? Those types of things. I would be interested to just hear in the chat box if people are willing to share what their company does. I think that, in looking at these 3 bullet points and on to the next page as well, I think the second 2 bullet points and these efforts regarding, transparency in the recruiting process, my 2 cents is that you probably see those have the largest impact on closing the gap. I think, the minor changes to what the current law is and making it based on a business factor, I think through litigation and court decisions and stuff like that, you may see the needle move a little bit, but I think really this idea of, getting to the very beginning and getting into the sort of what people are doing out there in the recruiting process and in the economy, I think that's probably where you're going to see the most potential benefit. And it's also, for some of my clients, and for some businesses that I talk to, the most problematic, because, for a long time, some recruiters and interviewers, have used this specifically as a tactic. If you've got a position that, is negotiable as far as how much it's gonna pay, if you're interviewing somebody that made $60,000 in the job they're coming from, and the interviewer, the recruiter, was thinking, well, I probably was going to pay this person around 80, but they were only making 60 at their last job, maybe they'll take 70. And I've just saved the business $10,000 a year because this person's expectations are relatively low from their last job. And I know businesses that view it that way. So, it is potentially controversial. But I think, all in all, this idea of wage ranges and transparency with respect to what you're willing to pay, and if you're willing to negotiate, is a positive thing.
Yeah, and I think it could also be the flip too, right? So if you're clear about what the wage range is, if somebody's expecting to be paid more for that position and you have a range you're working in, then that's going to help filter out some of the people who are applying for the position, right? So I think there could be also a positive impact for those who are responsible for doing, hiring and negotiating salaries with a business.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. There you go. Thanks. And I'll hit some of the rest of the pending legislation. One important point, Brandi hit on this, but when I was reading the actual legislation, it was linked from WREN's website. That I think that the key difference in this pending South Carolina legislation is it talks about comparable work. And, the Equal Pay Act talks about, and Title VII talks about substantially equal work. And so this shift to the idea of comparable work, goes to what she was talking about, where you've got one person in this position, one person in that position. Maybe they're even in completely separate departments and that type of thing, but this idea of comparable work sort of seeks to capture that. So that could be a big difference, but this law would apply to all categories, including gender identity and sexual orientation as well. They still have in there these business factors, or these non-discriminatory reasons that businesses could point to. Brittany, you can go on to the next slide for that. It's the seniority system, merit system, system that measures earnings by quantity or quality of production, or a factor other than protected category, such as education, training, or expense. But again, it's tied to those sort of legitimate business interests as opposed to, just anything. And I'll try to go a little bit more quickly because I know we're at 12:40. So, and I do want to allow time for questions if anybody has them. Please, post them or general comments in the chat box or the Q&A. So a couple of bullet points here on why advocates are pushing for for new laws on this. And I certainly have sort of beat the drum about the second bullet point. This idea of other than sex is extremely broad, and trying to tie that into legitimate business. There's also, a few just quirks like South Carolina law. The discrimination law is only applying to businesses with 15 or more employees. No explicit provisions concerning retaliation. And passing a law like this at South Carolina level could potentially provide affected employees with a state law cause of action and claim for that. So those are some of the things that are sort of pushing this new legislation forward. A couple of other legal things. Some governments, states and municipalities, have started banning inquiries into salary history, and we've touched on it. But the argument that sort of perpetuates the discrimination. I mean, if somebody is being paid $60,000 at their last job, well, yeah, but they may have been a victim of the last job of some kind of pay discrimination scheme. So upping their pay to $5,000 to $65,000 when you were going to pay them $70,000, that is not doing a whole lot of good. We don't have anything like that in statewide in South Carolina. I know that some municipalities have done that. The city of Columbia, for its employees, has banned the box, so to speak, on asking the criminal history on the initial application, as well as salary history on that initial application as well. So we'll I'll toss it over to Brandi, maybe talk a little bit about pay transparency and what businesses can do moving forward. We'll kind of talk about pay audits as well. And we've touched on this a little bit already with respect to the recruiting, but Brandi, do you have any sort of further thoughts on that?
No, I think we covered so much earlier about this. Yeah, I think that the more transparency you have around this, I think the more trust you build with your employees, and opportunities for more open communication. And yeah, so I mean, I think we're good to move to the next one if you're
okay. Yeah, and I've got an example up here on the next slide of what one company has done, and this is a company that has posted this online as just an example. Not only is this shared to all the employees within the company, but this is shared to members of the public. I mean, you can go on their website and figure out basically what you're making as an entry level and what it would take in certain instances to make more than that. And the formula is very basic, and it's salary equals job type times seniority times experience plus location. And then there's a little choice built in there between more equity or more salary. And if you have something like this in place, I mean, that is to the extent you get some claim from an employee that they were paid unfairly, having something like this, and I'm not saying it has to be this rigid, but having something like this in place, I mean, it's a great defense against claims of discrimination. You're applying your policy in this way that you've set up that's non-discriminatory. And this is just one example of it. And if you go to the next slide, this is also online. And this is what every person in the company makes. And you can, this is public information. I'm not revealing anything out of line here. Then this is what they put, and this is their choice on equity or salary, and the location where they work, and their seniority level, and their experience, and everybody in the company knows what everybody makes. Now, that is not going to work for every company. I mean, there's no one size fits all approach. Publishing online what everybody in your company makes, or even posting it internally. Let's say you've got an internal, Slack or message board or anything like that. That can lead to issues. I mean, there are valid reasons that businesses come to me and they tell me that they don't want X employee to know what Y employee is making. We all know that pay is very sensitive for some people. Some people do not like sharing that. Some people could care less if other employees know what they make. Other employees, it's as sensitive to them as their private health information, and so this may not work for everybody. It certainly could lead to more infighting between employees, and that could be a risk. So, all that needs to be balanced. I put this up here as an example of, what some companies out there are doing, and they've just sort of gone above and beyond sort of to say, look, the best way to deal with this is to be as transparent as possible and to be as open and honest as possible.
Great. And I just want to say too that the bill we talked about earlier in South Carolina is more about informing employees of the ranges, right? So yes, and pay transparency even within their the type of job that they have, right? Like where people stand as far as the different positions within, but not necessarily everybody within a company. So there's different ways, I think, of approaching this based on what's necessary or what works best for your business. So as we touched on earlier, the good news is most organizations in the country want to resolve pay inequities, and a lot are just looking for ways to do so, right? So most are focused on the pay equity analysis, the remediation strategies, and identifying and resolving root causes. And those are some things we touched on earlier. Again, having a compensation philosophy, assessing your job categories and descriptions is really key. Look at the overall diversity of your workforce, and having input from outside counsel is really important whenever you're doing a pay audit. Some people do third-party pay audits just so they don't have to be responsible for conducting them themselves. And they're all, that process can be very internal and private, but having someone who comes in and does that and helps establish that for the organization is not uncommon.
Yeah, and I think there's a number of ways to go about it. I think you're right. I think that I've done several for clients, and typically we will not look just only at what every employee is making, but use it as an opportunity to talk about, okay, well, you say this employee is paid more than this employee because of this. Well, you don't even have written job descriptions in place. So how can you show that? And we use it as an opportunity to talk about, okay, are these employees properly classified as hourly employees, or should they be salaried? And I'm talking about exempt and non-exempt there really, and so there's things like that, that you can look at as well as part of a large pay audit, or you could, certainly take a narrower, smaller focus on it. But I think it's a good idea for everyone to do if you haven't done it in a long time. I mean, I think it's, even if you just sort of do it internally, just as HR, keeping your eye on it and just seeing if anything pops out to you as being unusual or questionable. If it looks like that to you, it's going to look like that to somebody else.
Okay, so gender equity and inclusion is good for business. We have a workforce shortage. People are, employees are going to be looking for, the best situation for them and based on their skill set. So it's really great for attracting and retaining the best employees, to addressing the skill shortage, reducing the cost of turnover, improving access to target markets, and promoting creativity and innovation. So I just think all around having gender, equity and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion practices in place as a whole, not just around pay, but all things that apply, is really good for companies. And people are starting to expect it. So practical recommendations. So we've talked about many of these already, as far as conducting a pay audit, developing clear and transparent pay structures, providing salary ranges, not asking for salary history. I think it's really important too to provide implicit bias and interview training for leadership. Also putting together a diverse team of people who conduct interviews, I think is really great. And one of the other things, we practice this even in our small organization, is during the screening process, removing people's names and any identifying information on their, that would identify their race or ethnicity or gender on their application. I will say there's something that came up earlier that I thought would be kind of an interesting thing to add here too. We talked about having, being able to use your annual review as a justification for a pay increase, right? And, if you think about like that practice, how it affects women in particular. If a woman is out on maternity leave for a portion of the year, and you base her annual review on her performance for that year, and her time out has impacted that, then that is just changing that to, we'll base it on your previous year's performance, or at least not taking into account the time that she's out, so that's not a factor that works against her, is an example of how to kind of tweak your internal policies so that you're removing some of that gender-based discrimination that may not even be intentional or apparent in the beginning, but can affect an employee. So one of the things, as we mentioned before, that WREN does is work with business to ensure gender equity in the workplace. We have a playbook for advancing gender equity called Power Up Your Workplace. We look at several different, we kind of divide it into three different kind of categories: recruitment and hiring, retention and workplace culture, and leadership and advancement. And here are just a few of the examples of how or some of the things that we offer, is asking employees for input on culture, considering flexible work schedules. I think COVID has forced us to kind of rethink the way we do work. And I think some of those things that we've learned through this process should be applied, because allowing for flexible work schedules or working from home for part of the week really helps people who are responsible for caring for others, if the job allows for that. Providing paid sick leave and paid family medical leave, and then communicating clear pathways and opportunities for advancement, making sure everybody in the organization knows, right? Like, here's an opportunity, and here's how if you want to advance in this position, this is how we envision that happening. Professional development opportunities, as well as just exposing your employees to leadership opportunities and meetings and other settings within the business. So I'm trying to rush a little bit for time, so I hope I'm not talking too fast. I offer here a few of, and whenever you see the PowerPoint, there'll be links, but there's some research that we've done on the gender wealth gap which is different from the wage gap, of course, but gender wealth gap, gender wage gap, some other guides in promoting race equity and inclusion in the workplace. Yeah, so please feel free to use those. And I will say that in October, coming up this fall, WREN is going to be hosting probably a hybrid in-person and virtual forum that's going to be around building a gender equitable economy that really focuses on some of these workplace pieces. And so if you aren't a part of the WREN's network, I encourage you to visit our website at scwren.org. You can sign up to be a part of our, it's a membership. It's not any charge, but you can kind of know what's going on around some of these educational opportunities, or feel free to contact me directly if you have any questions about it.
Yeah, those are great resources and information. I encourage everybody to look at those last couple of slides. I think there's a lot of good information in there that we could probably talk a lot longer about. But given that we are out of time, we'll wrap up. I'm still happy to, well, Chris asked a question in the chat that I think only the panelists can see, but I'll read it because I think it's a good one. She said, what if no ranges are posted and a female is hired at $60,000 because she said that was what she would be happy with, and a male already in the position is paid $75,000? And that's a good question. I mean, assume you've got two senior accountant positions. You've got one person in the job making $75,000. And you're looking for another senior accountant, and you do the other classic interview tactic, which is how much do you want to be paid at this job? Which is sort of another tactic. And the person says, I'd be thrilled. I'd be over the moon with 60,000. So, $60,000, there you go. I think if the business's only justification for that is that that's how the person responded in the interview, I don't think that's going to pass legal muster. I think, particularly under what is being considered now and sort of the way that I think courts are trying to interpret even the current law, I think you're going to really need some sort of business justification for that differential if you've got one at 75 and one at 60. And again, could be the other person's been in the job longer and they've got, merit increases or whatever the case may be. But I don't think what somebody said in an interview that they'd be happy with would be good enough.
Yeah.
But that's
my question would be if she knew that someone was paid 75 for the same position, doing the same job with the same experience and background, she probably wouldn't be happy with the 60 if she was aware of that.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but yeah, I mean, those things happen all the time. I mean, that's a very common interview thing. I'm sure some of y'all have had familiarity with that. Some of you have probably used that before. So that's a very good question.
It is.
Any questions from anybody else? I'm not seeing any in the chat, but also happy to, I know we're right at 1 o'clock, also happy to answer any live if anybody wants to unmute themselves and speak up. Either way, I'll keep looking at those, but in the meantime, I will say that I will say thank you to Brandi and for SCWREN for joining us on this and doing this program with us. I hope that everybody got something out of that. Okay, I do see one question coming through, which is what's a good way to answer the question regarding salary expectation on an employment application? It's a good question. I think, I mean, if it were me and I'm just sort of thinking off the cuff, you want to, I mean, I'd be tempted to answer it in a way that doesn't put a number on it, but sort of says that you're expected to be compensated in line with what the other individuals at your company are being paid and what the others in your industry are being paid for similar job. I mean, I wouldn't want to be too cheeky about it, but something along those lines that doesn't, come off as smart alecky or something like that. But that doesn't tie you down to a specific number. What do you think, Brandi?
Yeah, there's some really great salary.com and some other resources where you can look at where you are in the region, in the country, and your position, responsibilities, and it can generate somewhat of a range for that. But I think there's no harm in saying, I would love to know what the range is for this position for other employees in similar positions, and would love to fall within that.
Yeah, that's a great point about the looking it up. I mean, I have seen, in my experience doing, interviews from time to time, I've seen people say that they looked up what so and so makes online, in these positions, what the average nationwide or regional salary is for that that type of thing. And so I think that would be perfectly fine as well. Okay, we're running after one. I know we're losing we're losing some people. I do want to just put in a quick plug for our next webinar on September 16th. Chris Gant Sorensen is going to be leading that up, and she's going to be welcoming Herb Johnson, who's a pretty well-known diversity and inclusion person in the upstate, and was the former chief diversity and inclusion officer for Michelin USA, and they're going to be talking about other DEI issues. So please join us for that as well. And thanks, Brandi, and thanks everybody else.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for joining this webinar presented by Hainsworth Sinclair Boyd. To learn more about the firm and its services, visit hsblawfirm.com.